If everyone could take their seats, we'll go ahead and get started. I want to welcome you all to the Woodrow Wilson Center. I'm Kent Hughes. I'm a public policy scholar here associated with the Global Europe program. And let me also wish you one and all a very happy Halloween. For those of you that are new to us, let me give you just a little background about the center itself. As you may know, Woodrow Wilson was the only president who had a PhD. He went on to be president of Princeton, governor of New Jersey, and then, of course, a two-term president. When Congress wanted to honor him, they decided against another marble statue or another monument on the mall, and instead created what they called a living memorial to President Wilson, where what we're charged with here is to bring together both sides of his life. That policy analyst, he was a very prominent political scientist in his academic era, together with people who are making or influencing policy here, really and around the country and increasingly around the world. Our president and CEO, former Congresswoman Jane Harman, has really honed our mission, and she emphasizes that we are the nation's key nonpartisan policy forum where we tackle global issues. And we do it through independent research. We will have, over the course of a year, 150 people that come here to do some kind of policy research. And we do it with a set of programs that literally cover the world, and you'll see some of that here today. Well, this morning, we're focusing on the political and economic impact of low oil prices. If it were 1973 or 1979, we might be talking about oil shortage or a sudden spike in oil prices. Today being Halloween, we might speculate that this Halloween, Dracula drank the oil. But instead oil prices have actually been falling. Yogi Berra, that widely quoted philosopher who starred with the New York Yankees, often warned us that it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future. You could certainly say that's true about oil prices as well. The current prices certainly are surprising. The American Automobile Association now reports that the average price of a gallon of gasoline across the entire United States is $3. So that's a nice treat for a lot of American drivers. And those who actually dare to think about the future, and Goldman Sachs is among them, are predicting lower oil prices that may persist into 2016. So this morning we're going to ask, what do these lower prices mean for a number of key oil producers? And to explore that question, we've assembled quite an array of experts. And let me introduce them briefly. Jan Kalitsky, who's the far end there, Jan, raise your hand if you would, is a public policy scholar here who's working on energy. He was formerly the Council for International Strategy at Chevron and a chairman of the Eurasia Foundation. He has recently come out with a second edition of his energy security volume. It's now available in paperback, and I promised him I would urge you all to buy a copy if you want to be up to date on energy questions. He brings just a world of corporate experience, public service, and research, an extensive academic background where he served in some key posts at Brown University. We were called on Raymond Gilpin, Dr. Gilpin, to give us a sense of what oil prices might mean for Nigeria. He is currently the academic dean at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. He previously served as the director of the Center for Sustainable Economics at the U.S. Institute of Peace, academic chair for Intelbridge Corporation, and research director at the Central Bank of Sierra Leone, among other major posts. His recent essays, Economic Drivers of Conflict, Tackling Energy Infrastructure, Vulnerability and Violence-Prone Zones, join a long list of other publications. His work draws on his doctorate in development economics from Cambridge University. Following Dr. Gilpin, we will turn to Risa Garayas-Targov. Am I saying that correctly? She leads the Eurasia Group's coverage on Venezuela, with an expertise that ranges from macroeconomic policy to oil and other kind of commodity prices. She brings to the subject an extensive background that includes positions with the Institute for International Finance, the U.S. Treasury, the Albright Stonebridge Group, and the Dow Jones Newswires. This is quite a collection of achievements. She has contributed to a publication that publications include NPR, BBC, Bloomberg, and a whole host of others. She holds a master's degree from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Will Pomerantz, Will, if you'd raise your hand. Will Pomerantz is the deputy director of the Kennan Institute here at the Wilson Center. He'll explore the impact of lower oil prices on the Russian Federation. He has a very deep background on Russia and Russian studies. He practiced law in Moscow for several years, where he advised clients on everything from export controls to the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Law. Of course, there are no reports of corruption in Moscow, so this must have been kind of a light practice. He also served as the program officer for Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus at the National Endowment for Democracy. At the Kennan Institute, Dr. Pomerantz directs the Kennan Institute's Rule of Law program. He's written on Russian law in a number of respected journals, and he holds not only a law degree, but a PhD in history from the University of London. David Ottaway, David, if you'd write. David is currently a senior scholar at the Wilson Center, where he's an active part of the center's Middle East program. He worked for 35 years as a foreign correspondent for the Washington Post. Many of you will have read his columns over the year. And he, in addition to the Middle East, he spent time in Southern Europe and in Africa, and then went on to focus on national security-related questions. He's a prize-winning journalist, twice listed as a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. He also builds on a distinguished academic background, but includes a PhD in history from Cambridge University. His most recent book is The King's Minister, Prince Bandar bin Sultan, and America's Tangled Relationship with Saudi Arabia. I am reading the book myself now, and I highly recommend it to you. Last but no means least, to my immediate left, I'm delighted to welcome Greg Ip, who will serve as today's moderator. After following his career on radio, television at the Wall Street Journal, and more recently The Economist, many of us got to know Greg during his recent stint as a public policy scholar at the Wilson Center. He will have a book based on that research coming out, I would guess, in December or early 2015, and so keep tuned. We will let you know when that's coming. Greg has an absolutely rare ability to speak economics and English at the same time, which is no mean feat. His 2010 book, The Little Book of Economics, How the Economy Works in the Real World, was described by USA Today as, quote, a must-read in economic literacy. Well, thank you all again for coming. Have a wonderful Halloween, and now we'll turn you over to an early treat of this panel of experts. Greg, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Ken. Just a couple words. I was here for 2 months earlier this year working on my own project, and I really enjoyed meeting the scholars, coming to events like this, and it's a pleasure to be back and once again taking part in the great debates that the Wilson Center promotes. The decline of the price of oil, just a few thoughts, has been preoccupying a lot of us who cover the global economy recently. We're used to thinking as falling oil prices as an unadulterated positive. Lower oil prices act like a tax cut for countries like us that consume a lot of the stuff. But the picture has gotten complicated recently because, well, the United States is now a major producer of oil, so there are negatives there that weren't there before. In some rich countries, they're now so worried about inflation being too low that a decline in the price of oil actually is a mixed blessing because it makes it harder to change that deflationary mindset. Just this morning, the Bank of Japan surprised the markets by announcing a new quantitative easing monetary policy, partly driven by concerns that the decline in the price of oil is making it harder for Japan to escape deflation. And finally, there's all those countries that actually are net exporters of oil, and those will be the focus of our discussions today. These are countries that rely heavily on the export of hydrocarbons, and the decline in the price of oil is obviously of great concern both to them economically and politically. So we have a terrific set of panelists here, as Kent was telling you, to discuss all these implications. And we're going to start with Jan on the far left over there, who's going to talk for 5 minutes about the global overview of what's going on.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Greg. It's a pleasure to be here. And in fact, Given the unique regional and geopolitical strengths here at the center, we decided to pursue the cross-cutting focus on energy policy and launched last July a bi-monthly regional and global energy series. So hold the date, in fact, for the next one on the North American Energy Security Renaissance, which will be next Thursday, November 6th. I'm sorry, not Halloween, but it's, I think, going to be an interesting topic and session, and that'll be from 10:30 a.m. to 12 noon. Today's topic, low oil prices, is especially timely. If we maintain $80 per barrel or less, there will likely be the equivalent of another economic stimulus for consumers, and it will also put additional pressure on producers. Of course, prolonged low prices are a hypothesis, and we certainly know from history that what goes down can also go up in the oil and gas business. And it's a fool's errand to make predictions for the long term on questions like oil prices. In helping to frame this hypothesis of low oil prices going on for some time at least, I'll say a few words about revenues, growth, industry, and the potential opportunities. First, revenues. Most oil producers have come to depend in their budgets on oil prices of $100 per barrel or more. A price drop of 20 to 25% will surely put them in a squeeze, and the issues will be their budget flexibility, their reserves, and of course the duration of the price drop. Part of the so-called oil curse is kleptocratic rulers. Of course, we know there is no corruption in places like Russia, and we'll confirm that. But there is this challenge in the oil business, and we can expect these rulers to do all they can to preserve their take, and that'll be at the expense of an increasingly impoverished population. Second, economic growth. As the IMF reminds us, most of the world faces at best anemic growth and dampened demand in the coming year. But China, the world's biggest energy consumer, is now adopting a large stimulus which will increase demand. Similar stimulus is underway in the Gulf states, which in fact are significant consumers, and prospectively in the EU, as we heard earlier from Kent. This increased demand will tend to drive oil prices up again, say, in the 12 to 18-month time frame. Third, the energy industry. This industry has generated overall 2 million more jobs in the US since 2008. US oil production has jumped 80% in this period, much of this due to fracking shale. But if we go below $80 per barrel, we will likely see a sharp slowdown of the shale business, which depends on high investment to drill more and more wells which have a high decline rate. Finally, the opportunities. Since the US and other consumers are increasingly producers and vice versa, the opportunities are mixed. Personally, I would prefer to see a steady price band, say in the $80 per barrel range, rather than the price gyrations of the past. In the domestic context, I'd favor a gas price floor. This has been suggested in the past. Say if we had a floor of around $3 per 25 cents per gallon, with revenues from the proceeds going into an energy security trust, for example, to upgrade our power transmission system here in the US. Back to the foreign context, OPEC meets later this month, particularly with the Saudis, who are the only ones with 2 to 3 million barrels spare capacity and huge financial reserves. I think this is an opportunity to discuss a price band which they had actually proposed in the past. The other general point I would make is that timing is critical. We need to move quickly to exert the leverage of high production and low prices. Iran is a case in point, in my view. Russia is a much harder nut to crack. We'll now hear much more from the regional and country perspective, and as we do, I think we should not assume that low oil prices are here to stay, but we can try to take advantage of our current stronger position for our economy and our foreign policy and that of our partners. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jan. We'll hear from Raymond Gilpin next, who's going to talk to us about the implications for Africa.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. Africa has 54 odd countries. It will take a while for me to go through all of them, so I'm going to choose one, Nigeria. Nigeria is the world's 10th most important oil producer in value terms, and so most people view Nigeria as a resource-rich country. I see it more as a resource-driven country, because if you look at oil in Nigeria per capita, it doesn't even make the top 20. It's resource-driven because oil revenues and oil investment drive not just the oil but the non-oil economy there. What's been happening lately in terms of falling oil prices has a lot of implications domestically and with also ramifications globally. But I'll talk very briefly about three issues. First would be trade and investment. Then I'll talk about some of the fiscal challenges, and then the political economy challenges that are linked to stability in the region. From an investment perspective, we all know that while Nigeria has vast reserves, pumps out over 2 million barrels of oil a day, it's been a while since they really invested in the infrastructure. New exploration has lagged significantly, largely because of the cost. With decreasing oil prices, you're going to see a reluctance of investment to flow into Nigeria to do the much needed upgrades in the infrastructure and also to have new exploration, because a lot of the wells, particularly on land, are past peak. Also in terms of trade, we're seeing in 2008, 46% of all Nigeria's exports came here to the United States. And now it's probably tending towards single digits. What that means is that there has to be significant trade diversion from the Nigerian side, which in many cases would be a little more costly for Nigeria. And so margins are going to be slimmer as declining oil prices begin to hurt. Fiscally, what's going to be the implication? And here's where you see usually the narrative: lower oil prices, more poverty, etc. For domestic budgeting purposes in Nigeria, it's a little complicated because Nigeria has a floor, $78 a barrel currently. And so the direct impact, if it stays where it is going to be in the medium term, not the immediate. What's going to hurt are the sovereign wealth funds, the excess crude account, and international reserves. Over the last few years, Nigeria has done quite an impressive job of keeping its international reserves at about 6 months of imports equivalent. If this continues, those are going to be drawn down significantly. The sovereign wealth funds that used to be at about $9 billion are now below $3 billion and dropping. What this would mean is that we're going to start seeing pressures being exerted on the currency, and the relatively stable naira has been the anchor for a lot of Nigeria's recent economic progress, including its leapfrogging South Africa as the largest economy on the continent. Political economy. Roughly between 200 and 300,000 barrels of oil a day are lost in Nigeria because of various shades of theft. And what that means is that it's a lucrative business, partly because the margins are so wide. With falling oil prices, you start to wonder what's going to happen along the supply chain. From the pumps to exports. Are we going to see violent competition between groups or among actors? Are we going to see a consolidation? In 2012, we did a study of illicit oil extraction in 3 communities, Cawthon, Channel, Okrika, and Bono. And what we notice is that you have highly organized and politically connected groups that are responsible for this extraction. So with this reduction in the political economy and with elections scheduled for early next year, And the fact that if you eyeball violence in Nigeria's oil-producing regions over time, and you superimpose major political events like elections, you would notice spikes that correlate. Are we going to see greater instability as people start competing for a decreasing share of the pie? We don't know, but it all depends on how the local political economy reconfigurates. One more thing about the political economy question is that while Nigeria has made some improvements at the federal level, at the state and local government level, you still have a lot more growing corruption in the state and local level because the oversight mechanisms are not in place, and the politicization is becoming even as pronounced as at the federal level. As Nigeria moves towards what everyone knows is going to be a very challenging election cycle, are we going to see intra and interstate conflict and violence? Some 170 million Nigerians on the planet, give or take a few. Instability in Nigeria would not only impact the oil markets, remember it's 2.3 million barrels of oil a day, but instability could also cause regional instability, which could have international implications, as we are seeing in the Northeast. And so from the investment side, the fiscal side, and the political economy side, it's not the usual questions and the usual issues. It's a more complicated mix, and this, the confluence of this fall in global oil prices and the pending elections in early 2015 pose a pretty daunting challenge.
Thank you very much, Raymond. Next, we'll hear from Risa, who's going to talk about Venezuela.
Thanks, Greg.
I think so.
Yeah? Okay. Thanks, Greg, and thanks for the Wilson Center for the invitation to be here today. As many of you probably know, the oil prices really make or break for Venezuela in particular when we think about countries in Latin America, but also countries globally that are oil producers. Oil represents 96% of Venezuela's exports, and critically, oil export revenue is the main source of dollars for a country that's highly dependent on basic imported goods, which has become even more important over the past several years as non-oil sector activity has declined. At the same time, economic distortions, policy distortions such as foreign exchange controls have contributed to mounting goods scarcity, which has had significant political ramifications. President Nicolas Maduro, who assumed office in spring of 2013, has seen his popularity fall steadily from 55% in April 2013 to around 30% in September. And respondents list goods scarcity resulting from lower levels of imports as their top concern, along with inflation and security challenges. As some of you may know, Maduro came to office and in a pretty weak position, having been named Hugo Chávez's successor, but he inherited an economy that was in a desperate need of an adjustment following Chávez's pre-election spending spree in 2012. However, Maduro's own weakness has prevented him from undertaking any meaningful reforms for fear of incurring any additional political costs. So we haven't seen the fiscal adjustment that really needed to take place, the foreign exchange adjustment that needed to take place this year, and any sort of revisiting of some of these very problematic policies such as price and foreign exchange controls. This also includes oil sector policy, where state-owned oil company PDVSA continues to be the government's main financing arm for its social programs and has been unable to meet its own investment commitments. To date, what we've seen is that higher oil prices have offset kind of the production declines and eliminated the government's urgency in addressing some of the issues in the oil sector. Oil production has declined steadily over the last decade from about 3.5 million barrels per day in the late 1990s to 2.5 million barrels per day currently. And we've seen kind of a stabilization in production, but again, at much lower levels than in the past. And critically, the government is continuing to fall short of its production goals for the future, especially in the Orinoco heavy oil belt. However, the government is now in a bit of an inflection point. The economy is rapidly deteriorating. It's set to contract by 3 to 4% this year. Inflation is in the low 60s and only going to rise. This increasing goods scarcity is obviously eating into the government's levels of support. And now the oil price is adding even more political uncertainty. Our view, what we've seen to date is that some of the protests against the government that were erupting earlier this year have been, they've been limited to the opposition. And so far, we haven't seen the Chavista base out in the streets protesting the very difficult economic situation. And with the military fully vested in this regime's survival, we haven't seen any real material threat to Maduro's ability to maintain power. However, I would say that the oil price here is really critical. And if the government does have much lower levels of export revenue with which to import basic goods, it could accelerate the risk of a political crisis and be the kind of catalyst for the base to finally say enough is enough and to take to the streets and really demand some sort of political change. I think we're still not quite there yet. Right now, Venezuela's oil basket price is around $76 per barrel. I think they can manage with anything between 80, maybe even pushing down to 75. And the average oil price for the year is still around 94. So I think that they still have some room to maneuver, and I don't see that political crisis as being just around the corner. Our view internally is that oil prices are going to recover somewhat, either later this year or early next year. And so we could get into an equilibrium where the government is still able to kind of limp along with oil prices around 80, as I mentioned. However, I think if we're wrong about our assumptions and we really do see a precipitous and sustained decline in oil prices, I think that only accelerates the risk of that political crisis I was talking about, and also threatens the government's ability to continue to service its debt and meet its commercial debt service internally. So I really see this as a potential catalyst for a political crisis and even regime change in Venezuela.
Thank you very much,
there.
Teresa.
Yeah.
And then we'll hear from Will
Well,
the situation in Russia.
The situation in Russia is very similar to those in Nigeria and Venezuela. Things aren't looking very rosy in the short term, that's for sure. The obvious consequence of the drop in oil is a loss of revenue. Almost 50% of the Russian budget comes from oil revenue, and that has obviously decreased, and that means less money for a variety of programs put forward by President Putin. His increase in the military budget is threatened by the fall in revenues. He won't have as much money to fulfill his various promises that he made in terms of increasing social spending during the 2012 presidential elections. And he won't have as much money for Crimea, which has already come in at between $10 and $15 billion and growing. So obviously a lack of revenue is a problem, which then leads to increased demand and requests on the substantial financial reserves that Russia has. Now, Russia did enter this crisis with almost $500 billion in the bank. It's their rainy day funds, but it is officially raining right now in Russia, and the money is going out. Indeed, over the last 6 months, 13% or 14% of these reserve funds have already been spent, and demand is only increasing. With increased pressure on the reserves, it means they don't have as much money to help the currency. The ruble has tumbled more than 20% since the beginning of this year. At various times, the Russian government has been spending up to $2 billion a day to support the ruble. That hasn't worked. Today, there was a substantial increase in interest rates, and we'll just have to wait and see whether that stabilizes the ruble. But essentially, the lack of revenue means lack of support for the ruble, which has a knock-on effect for inflation and the purchasing power of your average Russian citizen. The second major problem with this loss of revenue is that the Russian budget is already out of whack. The Minister of Finance proposed a new 2015 through 2017 budget 2 weeks ago, and then announced almost immediately that it was obsolete because it was based on the price of $100 a barrel for oil. He's now announced that he's thinking about a 10% cut across the board, which is a very substantial cut in the Russian budget. And unfortunately, the Russian media hasn't prepared anyone for such substantial cuts. So that's also looming. The third problem that has been raised by some of the other panelists is the impact on the actual energy industry in Russia. And again, in conjunction with the sanctions, the fall in the price of oil has had a really devastating short-term impact on Russia's energy producers. They were engaged in various joint ventures in the Arctic. Those are now off the table because of US sanctions. The oil companies in Russia cannot get Western financing. Again, that's not possible because of oil sanctions, because of the Western sanctions after the Crimea, as a result of the Crimea crisis. So therefore, there's only one place to turn. That is the Russian government. Rosneft basically has asked the Russian government for $50 billion, which is a huge amount of money, almost 10%, a significant amount of the available reserves. And again, there are other people lining up behind Rosneft as well, not only oil companies or banks, but banks as well, that are making significant demands on the Russian treasury. So the drop in the price of oil has really begun to impinge on the Russian government and its ability to carry out its various programs. The last parts I want to mention is really kind of the broader political and social impact of these developments. Obviously, Vladimir Putin has not been swayed in the last 6 months by economic arguments. He has proceeded to do what he wants to do from a geostrategic standpoint and has not really been concerned about the economic consequences. As a result, I think he has certain advantages going into this crisis. He has high popularity. He has no real political opposition. And he has hope, as Jan pointed out, that maybe things will change and that the price will go back up. But I think this crisis is a little bit different for Putin as well. As part of his return to power, he has made sure, or he has gone out of his way to really undermine all the intermediary institutions that could give him cover in this crisis. The parliament, the prime minister, and so forth. As a result, if indeed this crisis hits badly for Russia, there are no intermediary institutions to absorb this crisis, and the finger of blame will eventually be pointed all the way up to Putin, directly to Putin. I think his instincts most likely are to double down rather than to compromise, but that will cause various problems for Putin as well. The final point that I'll just briefly mention in light of this crisis is really the patience of the Russian people. They're not ones to take to the streets. They are patient, they are patriotic, and they also are highly reliant on the state for their salaries and for pensions. So we haven't as yet really seen a dramatic political response to this drop in oil revenue. But nevertheless, this crisis in many ways is different from other crises that have preceded. There's no enemy at the gate, as in World War II, and there's no real kind of broader ideological crisis, although Putin tries to create one. This is really a self-made crisis that has resulted in conjunction with Putin's actions in Crimea. And when you look at the legislation that Putin has been passing, in many ways the most glaring one is the so-called Rottenberg Law, which would force the Russian government to compensate oligarchs who have their villas expropriated in Italy. So again, this kind of reflects the mentality of the ruling elite going into this crisis, and I think they assume that they can rely on the patience of the Russian people, but that is not necessarily inexhaustible, and that's where I'll stop.
Thanks very much, Will. David, will
I'm going to talk about the Petro power part of the title of the today's session, and what Saudi Arabia appears to be up to as we head towards a meeting of the OPEC 12 on November 27 when the issue of whether OPEC will reduce its overall production and therefore put the price back up or not. The main accusation against Saudi Arabia is that it's really out to force down the prices to protect itself against the oil shale revolution and maintain its own market share in the midst of an oil glut. Now, the Saudis are very well positioned to take this battle on. They are been long considered the swing producer in the world because they have a capacity to produce 12.5 million barrels a day, and right now they are producing about 9.6 million barrels. So they can go up if there's a shortage somewhere, and they can go down very easily. And there's another reason they're in a very good position to play a key role in this struggle over the prices. And that's because it has huge reserves. Jan already mentioned $750 billion. It's the number third largest after China and Japan. And compared to its size of its budget, which was about $228 billion this year, it has enough foreign reserves to cover all the government spending if it didn't get a penny from oil for the next 3 years. Most people think that the break-even point, the price it needs in order to cover its budget is somewhere around $85 a barrel. But some estimates put it at $93 or $97 a barrel. It really depends on their level of spending, which they are already decreasing after 2 or 3 years of very high increases to deal with social problems as a result of the Arab Spring. Now, what we've noticed in the last few months is a sharp change in the Saudi attitude about what's an acceptable oil price. In May, the oil minister, Ali Al-Naimi, was suggesting $100 was a fair price for everybody. In June, the price went up to $115. And since then, in August and September, the Saudis have suggested that the $80 a barrel, which you've already mentioned, is good for them. And it's acceptable for OPEC. Now, what's going on behind all this? I'm not dealing with the shale. What's happening immediately today, what's going on? And what strikes me is there is this enormous scramble among oil producers for a share of the Chinese market. And China has started going around the world and buying oil at the lowest price that they can find. And this is affecting its sales to Saudi Arabia are down. Imports from Saudi Arabia down. Iran its exports to China are down because the Chinese are just going around the world and buying up oil where they can find it. And to my amazement, Colombia has become a major exporter of oil to China at a price well below what the Saudis sell it to China for. And Colombia's exports in the last 6 months have gone zooming up, 60% more to China, because they're selling oil for $94 to China, and the Saudis are selling it for $102. So there's this China, the determination of producers, and it's not just Colombia. It's Iraq started this at the beginning of the year by offering discount prices, and Kuwait followed. The Saudis cut their oil prices October 1 by $1 to everybody around the world. So this competition over price of oil is about to come to a head with this meeting in OPEC. Now, the Saudis, what's the effect been? I don't have too much time here to talk about Iran and Iraq, but Iran is really hurting. The sanctions have already cut their oil production down to about 1 million barrels from 2.5. So they're already hurting because they can't export as much as they used to, anywhere as near as much. But they've been forced to cut their oil prices to this competition for the Chinese market. And President Rouhani yesterday, or it was reported yesterday and the day before, told the Iranian parliament that Iran's oil revenues are down 30%. Now, this is going to put enormous economic pressure on the Iranians, and everybody who's following this is wondering how this is going to affect the negotiation over Iran's nuclear program and whether they're going to be willing to make exceptions, because the economic situation is really getting difficult for them there now. So that's one effect for one of Saudi Arabia's neighbor. The other one, Iraq. Iraq is in real trouble, but there are so many other factors other than the oil price war that is going on that it's hard to tell how much more of an impact it's going to have. They're losing, the Kurdistan in the north is now exporting its oil separately from the central government, so they're losing a lot of income from that. And nobody knows whether ISIS, the Islamic State, is going to end up affecting oil exports. So far it has not. Iraqi exports in September and October were 2.5, 2.6 million barrels. Well, that's quite good. And but if the fighting goes further south, this of course could affect them quite substantially. So there are a lot of other factors in the price war affecting Iraq, but I think the most interesting issue is what the impact on Iran and how it's going to impact their decisions in the nuclear negotiations.
Thanks very much. To start out the conversation, I'd like to explore what are the foreign policy implications of this decline in the price of oil. Specifically, how does it affect the adventurism that some of these regimes have indulged in recently, and also the domestic stability of countries like Nigeria, and more globally, whether it strengthens or weakens the hand of the United States in some of its goals. Will, I'd like to start with you. We were talking before the event. Back in 1985, when the price of oil collapsed, this was kind of like a major pillar knocked out from under the Soviet regime. What are the prospects that this weakening in the price of oil also affects Russian adventurism in places like Ukraine and its Near East, if not now, then eventually?
Well, I think it will have an impact over time. And in many ways, the agreement that was made yesterday over gas, you can argue over natural gas and the deliveries of natural gas from Russia to Ukraine, was a result of this economic downturn in Russia. Russia, as I've mentioned, is in desperate need for hard currency reserves. And the only way for it to maintain the natural gas hard currency reserves is to make sure that it delivers gas to Ukraine and that Ukraine forwards that gas as appropriate onto Eastern Europe. So that there was pressure on Russia to at least come to some agreement on gas, and I think that is in light of this ongoing energy crisis. I think in terms of how Russia acts going forward, I think in many ways the price of gas will be one and oil will be one variable, but I also think the ability to maintain sanctions on Russia will be the second variable. And in that instance, the EU is maintaining its sanctions and will reconsider its sanctions in March. If indeed there's a change in the sanctions regime come March.
To harder, tougher, or weaker?
Most likely weaker, although there's, again, the EU has threatened that if Russia recognizes the upcoming elections in Donetsk and Luhansk, they're going to increase sanctions. So it's going a lot of different directions right now. But if indeed the sanctions are weakened, in March. And there are lots of European countries who are advocating for lessening the sanctions, including Italy, Hungary, Luxembourg. A whole bunch of countries are being hurt themselves by the sanctions. So indeed, if there's a change in the sanctions policy, then Putin would have succeeded in kind of pursuing this divide and conquer strategy that will give him more leeway in terms of how he deals with the East. So there are lots of different variables in terms of how he approaches the Ukrainian question.
Risa, what about Venezuela? I mean, under Chavez, Venezuela was a constant thorn in the side of the United States, partly because it would use its oil resources to prop up Cuba and other countries. How does this decline in the price of oil affect Venezuela's presence and its projection of influence in its neighborhood?
Yeah, it's a great question. What we see is that Venezuela is already starting to scale back its petro diplomacy programs, such as Petrocaribe and some of the other arrangements it's had in the region. Last year, we saw them basically completely eliminate their arrangements that they had with Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay. And this year, we see that the Petrocaribe program, whereby the government gives oil at highly concessional loans to members or countries in Central America and the Caribbean, has declined a lot as well. So we see about a 20% reduction in exports to member countries, and actually even Cuba. Looking at the export numbers for Cuba, that they're down. This is private tanker data, but that they're down about almost 40% in the last 2 years. I think if anything, the lower oil prices just accelerates the government's their need to scale back these programs. And I think that has really significant ramifications for these member countries, especially Cuba, but others such as the Dominican Republic, Jamaica, Nicaragua. And I think it also offers an interesting opportunity for the U.S. to engage more in a region where Venezuela has been pretty dominant in the past decade or so.
Thanks. Raymond, talk about the situation for Nigeria, possibly in terms of, I don't know, Nigeria's international relations, but more importantly for this ongoing insurgency that it faces with Boko Haram.
Yeah, absolutely. Nigeria, if you recall from the recent US-Africa forum, we had a lot of talk about regional anchors on the continent, and Nigeria is one of them. It's important from a peacekeeping perspective. Remember in the 1990s, it almost unilaterally bankrolled peacekeeping in 2 West African countries. As we think about expanding peace support operations, it's a lot easier and better for Nigeria to deploy than for US troops to deploy. And a lot of the financial and the fiscal burdens that this drop in oil prices, if it were sustained, could affect in Nigeria would diminish its capacity to do so. There's also the issue that Nigeria has a growing middle class. And it's a really important market for consumer goods, for services, etc. Nigerian banks are syndicated across Africa. Significant pressures on the naira would undermine competitiveness and viability of a lot of these banks, and would wreak havoc not just in Nigeria, but in a number of other countries. What does this mean in terms of stability, and both in the northeast and in the south? It's difficult to say right now, but what a lot of analysts seem to believe is that there is a connection between the scale of oil theft and the flow of small arms and light weapons into Nigeria, and also the funding of the groups that perpetrate the violence. Should we see a consolidation or violent competition for dwindling resources, it could put pressure on a Nigerian army that's obviously ill-prepared to address a lot of these challenges. So worst case scenario, we'll see a worsening of insecurity. Best case scenario, we would see a whittling out of a number of the players, and which would enable the government and its international partners to focus on the few that become prominent. And so it could go either way. From a US foreign policy perspective, I think it behooves us to understand these dynamics now, to start disaggregating the influencers from the spoilers, and understand how you disincentivize the spoilers and you provide the influencers with the space they need to start making the much needed adjustments that Nigeria needs to make.
David, you were touching on the situation in Saudi Arabia and Iran, but to what extent is Saudi Arabia's behavior vis-a-vis the price driven by a desire to destabilize Iran as part of its larger, Shiite-Sunni rivalry in that region?
Well, that's a good question. This reminds me of what was the reason for Saudi behavior in the mid-'80s? Were they out to help sink the Soviet Union or not by driving prices way down? And actually, I looked into that, and as far as I could see, it had much more to do with a rivalry among the OPEC members and what market share and its impact on Russia was secondary. I mean, it was kind of collateral damage and not the main reason for doing it, but it did have quite an impact on Soviet Union. Yes, they're in this incredible rivalry with Iran right now. It's kind of a showdown between the two across the Levant and that part, the Gulf and Levant. But I think it's really, once again, Saudi Arabia's concern for its position in OPEC, and it's showing that it has ability to control, that it is the price maker or the price breaker, and their determination to maintain a key role over the oil market in front of all this competition coming at them from even their own allies, even Iraq and Kuwait, and we saw this in the OPEC struggle of the mid-'80s. So I think that has a lot more to do with who's going to, Saudi Arabia determined to maintain, it wants to be number one in China's market as the main exporter of oil to China. It's about 1 million barrels now. And it's got a lot more to do to maintaining its market share than it does politics, undermining Iran.
It's just kind of a secondary benefit. In a few minutes, we're going to turn to some questions. So if you have questions, put your hand up. We have mic runners who can get a mic to you. But I'd like to, before I do that, so get your questions ready. Jan, I'd like to ask you, we've just heard about how, for example, this drop in the price of oil makes life harder for Russia, for Venezuela to, cause mischief, has these interesting dynamics for Iran and, of course, Nigeria. A year from now, will the United States look back at this and say this was an event that made the United States' position stronger in the world, or weaker, or unclear?
Well, I think that part of that has to do with the leadership that the U.S. exerts. And this is a continuing challenge, in my opinion, partly because of the dysfunctionality of our political process here at home, and partly because our bandwidth in foreign policy terms is so focused on the immediate threats that we face in the Middle East and such. But really, I think that there is an opportunity here. There's a window, which is not a very wide one, for doing some very significant things in energy diplomacy. One of these things has to do with the price band. The Saudis have expressed explicitly in the past to the U.S. an interest in encouraging. You can't dominate, you can't control a market like this, but the Saudis have a very important swing influence to try to move things in the direction of more predictability and stability in energy pricing. And I think that's in everybody's interest. If you have swings, they're going to hurt people on both sides. And especially given the fact that consumers are now producers, producers are consumers, it's a mixed bag. And we have to really keep our eye on the ball in terms of what we can do internationally to take advantage of that. The other thing is here at home. Everybody's celebrating, and I will too, the $3, it's $2.95 actually in one of my gas stations near where I live. And that's wonderful. But I would be much more reassured, and I know that that's simply politically beyond reach for reasons that I find unconscionable. We should be pushing hard for $3.25 or whatever it is, price point, after which we establish an energy security trust for anything below that price point, which goes into badly needed infrastructure spending here at home. If you look at the transmission lines for power here in the United States, they're in terrible shape. And we have all these shortages that we all know about in the summer. Well, this is the time when we have the advantage of an energy dividend to show leadership, whether it's here in the United States or it is overseas. And you know, we have to get in the mindset now of being proactive instead of reactive on issues of energy security.
Thanks very much, Jan. Let's get some questions now. We'll start with you there.
Thank you.
Please give us your name and your
Sure.
affiliation.
My name is Thomas O'Keefe. I'm from the Foreign Service Institute. My two questions are directed to Risa Grice Targo. You mentioned that if the economic situation in Venezuela continues to deteriorate, one of the things that you foresee is regime change. What exactly do you mean by that? Are we talking about an impeachment, a military coup? And the other question I had also was, with the pullback of Petro Caribe in the Caribbean and Central America, you also mentioned that you foresee increased U.S. engagement with that part of the world. What type of engagement specifically?
Mhm.
Thank you.
The regime change question is a good one. I think that the military, the idea of a military coup, some sort of coordinated military coup, is it's difficult to foresee in the sense that the military is already in power. I mean, this already is a military government, and I think Maduro very smartly, since he came into office, has been increasing the role of the military in his government to help ensure his survival. When I think about transition scenarios, that's why I see it being something that has to come from within Chavismo and within the voter base, and a scenario where there are massive protests, where the base is out in the streets, at which point I don't think the military would necessarily be willing to defend the government. That also means, though, that I think there are different factions within the military. We have a very divided Chavismo, very divided opposition. So when I think about that transition scenario, I also think there's a possibility that you have something that's very messy, where certain parts of the military are siding with different leaders within Chavismo, others with different figures in the opposition, and it's really hard to see kind of a clear path out of that. But I think that any transition scenario would probably be one that is quite messy when we think of any scenario happening before Maduro's term is up. In terms of Petro Caribe, I think one area, and I mean, Jan was alluding to the fact that the U.S. has very limited bandwidth right now in terms of foreign policy. But I do think that one area where the U.S. can work with member countries is that these countries have been very slow to update their grids or move away from fuel oil dependency because they had this very cheap oil coming from Venezuela. And in an environment where these countries are increasingly thinking about alternatives, cheaper alternatives like coal and gas because they aren't receiving that cheap oil, I think the U.S. and U.S. companies, especially those in the power sector, can play a role in helping these countries kind of move their energy policies in a different direction. So that's one area where I see a lot of room for cooperation.
Thanks. Yes, right there.
My name's Thomas Grindley. Recently, an interesting documentary has come out called Pump, which touts flexi-fuels at the gas pumps and claims that oil companies are resisting flexi-fuels, which would have an important impact on biomass-based fuels, such as methanol and ethanol. Have you seen this documentary? And in any case, what is your opinion about flexi-fuels?
Jan, I'm going to ask you to take that one. That seems to relate directly to diversification. And
I'm not a technical expert from Chevron or anywhere else, but I will tell you that from what I've heard about, and I have not seen the documentary, But what I've heard about the opposition to this, it's not the oil companies so much as the auto industry, which doesn't like the idea of having its warranties put to the test by fuels that the machines may not process as well as they should. So I think that the question should be addressed as much to Detroit as to Houston. And as to the idea of diversifying the fuel mix, there's already, as you know, an E10 requirement. People have talked about E15. I personally think the idea of using food for gas is absolutely absurd, and we shouldn't be going to E15. We should be looking at food security just as much as energy security. As to other fuel sources, yes, anything we can do to diversify the mix that meets the requirements of the machines and make sure that we don't get into trouble when we drive our cars to the office is something that I would favor.
Will, you wanted to add something?
I'm not an expert on flexi fuels, but Vladimir Putin is a very outspoken opponent of fracking. And it's very interesting that he's suddenly developed such a strong environmental conscience at this stage.
Thanks very much. Yes, down here. Sir, can you wait for a microphone, please, and state your name?
I'm Jeff Bobier, independent investor. I'd like to ask you, Dr. Pomerantz, what is your opinion of the effect that lower oil prices might have on the developing relationship between Russia and China in their energy relationship?
Well, obviously Russia, like other countries, views China as a very important new market for it to explore. It has signed various agreements with the Chinese to increase the delivery of oil and gas to China. So it sees that as a market and part of Russia's broader strategy of its own kind of pivot towards Asia. I think the risk that Russia faces in the short term is not necessarily finding new partners, but how does Russia get through this short-term financial crisis? And I think in many ways, since Western financing is closed to Russia, I think there's an increased possibility that Russia will have to turn to China if indeed this crisis continues over a longer period of time. And then Russia will have to consider what are its foreign policy consequences for being so indebted to the Chinese.
Can I offer a quick caveat on that, which is that the Chinese, of course, do not feel required to accept higher Russian oil prices or gas prices compared to lower ones that may be available elsewhere. So the Russians have not only their bilateral relationship to worry about, they have the competition to worry about globally as far as supplies to China are concerned.
And of course, in the most recent deal between the Russian and the Chinese, the Russians never included the price for the gas that was going to be going to China,
Right.
which is always a sign that maybe it wasn't quite as good of a deal as the Russians had made out to be.
Can be shifted? I mean, is that the provision of the contracts?
I believe it's anticipated in those types of contracts, price would be able to shift.
Yes, but I think Will is right on point that not talking about gas price suggests that the Chinese have the idea that the gas price will be lower and that the Russians have the idea it will be higher. We've seen this for a long time, and they've called this the deal of the century. I think it might take a century for the deal to actually materialize.
Yeah, it's interesting. A deal of the century that doesn't actually include the price. That's, let me see. Why don't we have get you? Yeah, it's right. It's right over here behind you.
Hi, Anthony Odie, formerly with the World Bank. I think the question is for Jan Kalitsky. You alluded in your remarks to the impact of low oil on the new U.S. Unconventional energy, fracking, and so on. Walk us through a few scenarios of how long does it take with prices at this level for that industry to really be hurt? How well capitalized are they to ride out a period of low prices? These kind of issues.
A good question, and part of the answer is that the industry started developing really through the wildcatters. It's the independents who really started moving this, and the majors came in after that in order to develop it further. As you can see from that, and indeed still in terms of expanding the horizons of shale gas, you see the independents playing a very important role. Now the capitalization of the majors is much higher than the capitalization of the independents, let alone the wildcatters. And when you have a situation where they really do depend on returns that are predicated at $80 plus, you can see that the ones that are really the pushers for getting us into a more, even a larger shale gas position will be much more exposed much earlier. As far as the majors are concerned, they might be able to ride it out more. And I don't see the majors just abandoning the field for a very good reason. To the extent that there are license requirements, and often there are license requirements in fields of this type, they need to make sure that they are still active to a certain extent in order to meet the requirements. As I said before, much of this is privately based. So it gets back to the basic economics of the shale gas business, and it's the $80 price point is quite important in that regard.
We have, oh, sorry, did you want to?
Yeah, just a quick one. I think a similar scenario could play out in a lot of the African countries that are the new oil countries, countries along the southwest of Africa, the Great Lakes region. We have a lot of independent prospectors going in. And most of these countries, some of them have already started to anticipate fiscal gains, etc., but it's all predicated on something that's around 80, 85. Anything lower, and what we've seen in a number of African countries is that these smaller independents would walk, and then the governments would be left high and dry. And so I know I talked just about Nigeria, but on the African continent, you have the old oil, the established oil countries that do have a lot of the major IOCs, but then you have a lot of other countries who are entering the market now, but it is via the independents, and that is problematic.
We have a question back there in the far left corner. Can I get a mic up to him?
Mohamed Barkindo, GMU. I think Raymond made reference, I'm sorry, I hope I got the name correctly, the speaker who spoke on Nigeria, Raymond.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you made reference to the almost drying up of Nigerian crude oil exports to the United States, which is a fact. The U.S. used to be the #1 destination of exports of Nigerian hydrocarbons. Now, do you see a possible shift or downgrading of political relations between Washington and Abuja as a result of this major economic shift? Both President Bush Jr. and Clinton before him did pay state visits to Nigeria, did upgrade relations between Washington and Nigeria in their various ways and capacities. We haven't seen or heard President Barack Obama even mentioned about Nigeria other than about Boko Haram. Thank you.
No, thank you. A pretty complex question. Let me see if I could take it in bits. The reduction in the Nigerian exports to the United States is not a function of foreign policy. So it's not a function of foreign policy in foreign policy decision. It's mainly a market-based decision that the bad thing, well, the downside for Nigeria is that quality and type of oil that it exports is very, very close to the shale oil. And so there was a substitution effect that took place. And that's why Nigeria ended up being disadvantaged. Nigeria has, however, taken steps to diversify. It's finding it difficult, of course, because it's not so easy to enter a lot of lucrative markets, but it has diversified northwards and eastwards and also in its neighborhood. The U.S.-Nigerian relations, will they be hurt by this? I don't think so. I think that there are a lot of other things that the U.S. and Nigeria could collaborate upon. There is the Power Africa initiative that is very important, electrification in Nigeria, an important downstream issue. You also have the new approach to peacekeeping, and Nigeria is a regional anchor for peacekeeping. So there are a number of other things that the US and Nigeria could and are continue to collaborate on. I don't think that this reduction in the share of Nigerian exports to the US is a foreign policy driver.
Yes, right in front of you there.
Thank you. My name is Yaya Fenusi. I'm with the United States of Africa 2017 project, and this is for Dr. Gilpin. First, Nigeria and South Africa, the two countries are opposing our 2017 date. And I'm glad that both those economies are facing problems. And in this case, we know that our lobbying with them will increase them to support the United States of Africa 2017 project. Otherwise, the boat will be shredded.
Thank you. How about right here?
I'm Ken Vincent, DOE. Another Venezuela question, 2 parts. First part, how many quarters worth of debt service would Venezuela have if oil prices stay in the 80s? And the second part is, if debt service gets to crisis proportions, are they going to cut more from Petrocarib? Are they going to cut domestic fuel subsidies? Or are they going to cut other social spending?
It's a good question. I think with oil prices at 80, and assuming that they maintain the current amount of imports or cut them a little bit, and then do some sort of fiscal adjustment on, I think they're going to have to devalue in the next few months, they can continue to certainly service their debt in 2015 and potentially 2016, but it's going to get increasingly uncertain. In terms of their resources, I mean, I see them both right now scaling back on Petrocaribe, but also very much focused on increasing cash-generating exports in general. So we see them scaling back Petrocaribe, which I think they'll continue to be more aggressive about next year, probably maintain a minimum amount for Cuba. Cuba's internal demand is about 40,000 barrels per day, and they've been getting 100,000 barrels per day, using the rest as basically as a fiscal subsidy. So I see them cutting back Cuba further, cutting the rest of it further. But we also see them actually renegotiating terms with China. So, you know, they've been exporting around 330,000 barrels per day to China as loan repayment. The import figures from China show that those numbers are down to around 200,000 barrels per day in crude and products. And that's obviously some additional cash that they have to work with too. I see the government right now as, you know, they're in a very short-term focused survival mode where they're looking for cash anywhere they can get it. I think the cash-generating exports, looking for additional loans, whether, you know, further debt issuance, some sort of swap, are kind of the main goals. I think the domestic subsidy is really hard to touch, especially with the government facing elections next year, National Assembly elections. They've been talking about it for a long time. For those of you who don't know, Venezuelan oil is about 9 cents per gallon domestically. They could, I mean, if they cut that, they could generate about $13 billion a year. I mean, it's huge. But I just think, I mean, this is a government that is really terrified to do anything that could have, you know, political ramifications, and that one is potentially destabilizing. So I think that's off the table for now. I was actually in Caracas last week, and officials more or less told me that. I think maybe you'll see some sort of domestic fuel subsidy cut back in 2016, 2017, but I would also expect it to be pretty gradual. I don't see them just eliminating it outright.
David, I'd like to actually ask you a related question, which is obviously Saudi Arabia supports a very generous welfare state because of the oil. To what extent is that threatened by this decline in price? And to what extent is Saudi's own recent lowering of the price controversial within Saudi itself?
It is somewhat controversial inside Saudi Arabia. One of Saudi Arabia's leading billionaires, Al-Walid bin Talal, wrote an open letter to the oil minister a couple weeks ago, saying this could be a catastrophe if the prices keep going down, and urging the government to, in effect, keep prices up by cutting production. Now, we've never seen anything like that before in Saudi Arabia, somebody coming out like that, a member of the royal family. So it's highly unusual. I do not think it would be a catastrophe for the economy or the spending level of the government to have oil at $80 or $75. Nonetheless, it's clear that there's a debate within the royal family about whether they should cut production in order to keep prices up. And I don't know how this is going to turn out. I think it has a lot more to do with whether the other OPEC members are willing to go along with production cuts on November 27th. If they're not, I think the Saudis will maintain their production level, which is going to force down prices considerably below 80.
What was Talal's concern? I mean, why is it a disaster from his point of view?
You know, I couldn't figure out why he thought it was going to be a disaster. I think it has something to do with the Ben Talals are kind of dissidents within the royal family, and they often come out and attack privately or publicly the rest of the ruling royal family, which right now is King Abdullah. So to me, it was more something going on among the ruling family members than it was over the reality of this being a possible catastrophe for the country.
Interesting. Let's see. Right here, please. Microphone coming to you.
Thomas Lemmert with the Belgian Embassy. I have a question for Dr. Pomerantz on the Iran nuclear talks and the impact of the lower oil prices on the Russian position. I would imagine that getting to a deal or to a breakthrough, if ever that would work out, would, in the medium term, also see an easing of the sanctions and an increase of the Iranian oil exports, which could have an impact on the global oil prices. My question is, do the Russians have a negative incentive, given the possible impact on the oil price, in getting to a deal on the Iran nuclear talks?
I think Russia does have divided incentives in terms of how they approach the nuclear talks. And yes, I think Russia is very much aware of the consequences of somehow enabling Iran to have the sanctions reduced or lifted from Iran, and what that means not only for Russian sales of oil, but also Central Asian sales of oil, and all the various pipelines that have been created over the last 10 to 20 years, which have made sure that they avoid Iran and find different ways to get their the products delivered to Europe and to international markets. If indeed the sanctions were to be lifted on Iran, and suddenly oil could flow north to south again through Iran and not have to go through the various pipelines that have been constructed, then yes, Russia loses another advantage that it has gained over the last 15 years in terms of the distribution of oil to Europe. So yes, Russia does have various conflicts as it approaches these negotiations, and yes, Russia from a certain standpoint doesn't want to let another player onto the international market that will be competing with Russia on a variety of levels.
We have time for perhaps one more question. How about you there, just on the, no, sorry, on the aisle.
Hi, I'm Kwaku24, and I guess I'm just coming as myself. I've come across some articles and some data about the Republic of Congo, and that they've got a lot of oil over there. I was wondering, what effect do they have right now on the global demand, and do you see an increase in that in the near future?
Sounds like one for you, Raymond.
Yeah, thanks. The Republic of Congo and a number of other African countries are at the exploration stage right now, looking at new deposits and trying to bring them to market. The impact that this decline in global oil prices is likely to have is that investors would be very apprehensive about entering these markets. Margins will be tight, so you probably wouldn't get the majorly technologically endowed firms coming into the countries, and those first steps, as we know, could be problematic with the impacts going for many, many, many years after the contracts are signed. And so I think that's the bad news. The good news is that it should probably force these countries to be a lot more judicious in their engagements and in the contracts that they sign, and really understand the implications and also who bears the risk for these investments. Because in many of these countries, the state bears a proportion of the risk, and it's important to be able to quantify those up front.
We're drawing towards the end of the event, and so I'd like to actually just to finish off with a question that occurred to me as I was listening to everything you were talking about. Of course, the defining characteristic of a petrostate is that petroleum is the only game in town for many of them. Many of these countries have very few other significant industrial sectors to fall back upon. What are the prospects that what we've seen in the price of oil sets in motion a diversification in some of these economies so that they become less sort of petrostate driven and less exposed to these price moves? Let's just sort of go down, starting with you, Raymond.
Yeah, in Nigeria, there has been a creeping diversification, because if you remember the rebasing of the economy recently, what emerged was that telecoms, finance, services were real movers, and they contributed a lot more than we had anticipated. But the problem from a fiscal perspective is that the tax effort has always been directed at the oil sector. And Nigeria doesn't know how to garner fiscal revenue from the non-oil sector, partly because of capacity and institutional weaknesses, and also partly because of corruption. And they need to do that if they're and also have a lot more investments in infrastructure that supports the non-oil sector to make it happen. And so this might be a wake-up call, but it all depends on how long this downturn lasts.
Interesting. Risa?
I mean, I think Venezuela, if anything, has been going in the other direction and concentrating more and more of its economy on oil. I don't see this really changing that strategy. I think, if anything, the government has been choking off a lot of other sectors of the economy. What I do think we could see is the government moving a bit more aggressively on oil sector policy. I mean, Venezuela does have the largest oil reserves in the world, and there's a lot of potential there. There have just been some very key policy bottlenecks that have slowed investment, particularly from PDVSA's foreign partners. So I think the bet is going to be more on increasing production, even at lower prices, than trying to move away from the oil sector.
Well, the Russians have been talking about diversification since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and they've never managed really to do it. And what's very interesting about this particular crisis is that the cyclical nature of this crisis should play to Russia's advantage, in the sense that a collapsing ruble should make their exports more competitive, should promote domestic manufacturing, and attract foreign investment. Those are kind of the standard arguments. And yet, when you look at the Russian economy today, one doesn't anticipate that any of those will occur during this crisis. It doesn't export that much. It doesn't really have an entrepreneurial class. Indeed, a lot of their entrepreneurs have found themselves in jail, as opposed to being able to actually engage in entrepreneurial activity. And the sanctions make foreign investment just very difficult. So they don't have a diversified economy, and they're not in a position to take advantage of some of the things that are available to them.
David, I don't know if you have any thoughts about Middle East countries on that.
Well, I can talk about Saudi Arabia. Believe it or not, they're actually working quite hard on diversifying. And the main reason they're doing it is that their internal consumption of oil is going up very quickly, which is limiting what they can export. So they want to, they're going into big time into solar plants, developing it, and gas rather than oil.
Who'd have thunk it? Saudi Arabia, solar energy.
Running their desalinization plants. So they're very conscious of this, believe it or not. And they have the money to do it.
Jan, any final thoughts?
Well, yeah, I think that this is, again, an example of what do we do with the window that I was talking about, which is not going to be there for a very long time. To my mind, one of the most important initiatives that can be undertaken at this point is one that deals with energy poverty. You know, over 1.4 billion people do not have access to electricity in the world. If we have a dividend It seems to me that there are domestic economic initiatives, as I mentioned, that could be taken to take advantage of that dividend. There are international initiatives. If we can have borderless transmission lines, if we can get into development of electric power sources for people who are in poorer countries, these are important steps to take. I think one has to have some imagination here and not just say, you know, what do we do about the kleptocrats? Well, they're going to keep on taking their take. They are going to be there, and the other people are going to be poorer and poorer. That's going to be the general perspective. But there are positive things that can be done, and they have to be done soon in order to take advantage of this window of opportunity.
Thanks. So I think that sort of sums it up, that what we're seeing in the price of oil means a lot for some countries, but it means a lot for the whole world. It's going to have a big impact on various diversification, on development, consumption, standards of living. It's been a great discussion. I learned a lot. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the panelists and thank all of you for your questions and your interest.